All right, listener, get ready for a deep dive. It's going to be a fascinating one, especially for someone with a philosophical mind like yours. We're going to be tackling a big one today, immutability. But more specifically, as it relates to a divine being,
It's a really big one.
it is. And our main source for all of this, you guessed it, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Immutability isn't just some kind of abstract philosophical idea.
Right.
It really gets to the core of how we think about God and God's relationship to, well, everything, to the world, to time, even to the concept of change itself.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly do we even mean when we use this word immutability in this context?
It basically means unchangeableness. But of course, when you're talking about God, it can't be quite that simple. To really get a grasp on it, we need to go back and see how ancient and medieval philosophers thought about change in general. They were really focused on this distinction between essential and accidental properties.
Right. Not all changes are the same.
Yeah,
Some changes are more surface level, while others change the very essence of a thing.
exactly. So imagine, like, a lump of clay. You can mold that lump of clay into different shapes. A pot, a sculpture, anything really. But no matter how you change its form, it's still clay, right?
So its clayness is an essential property.
Yeah.
You can't change that without changing the object itself.
Exactly. But the shape of that clay is an accidental property that can change without changing what the clay actually is. Now, the classical and medieval thinkers applied the same logic to God. They argued that God, since God is perfect and complete, can't really go through any changes that would alter God's fundamental nature.
So when we talk about divine immutability, we're saying that God cannot change in any way that affects God's fundamental being.
You got it. But it gets even more complicated because you can even divide accidental properties into intrinsic and extrinsic properties.
Okay.
So an intrinsic change is a change that happens within the thing itself. Like if a clay pot were to crack, that's an intrinsic change.
But if you were to, let's say, move that pot into another room, that would be an extrinsic change. So it's a change in its relationship to its surroundings, not in the pot itself.
You got it. So now apply that to God. Can God undergo intrinsic changes? Could God's knowledge, for example, change? Maybe God loses some knowledge or gains some knowledge. Or could God's power change? These are the kind of questions philosophers have been asking for centuries.
And, just to add another layer of complexity here, we have to be careful not to get immutability mixed up with impassibility.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people make that mistake. Immutability, remember, means that God can't change. But impassibility means that God can't be affected by any outside forces. They're related, but they're not the same.
So could God be immutable but not impassible?
That's a question that's caused a lot of debate. It's kind of like, think of a perfectly still lake. It's unchanging in its stillness, but if you throw a rock into it, the surface is affected. You get ripples. So could God be like that? Unchanging at God's core, but still capable of being changed by the world in some way.
Whoa, this is already making my head spin.
It's a lot.
It is. But before we dive too deep into all of that, let's talk about why so many thinkers throughout history have been drawn to this idea of divine immutability.
Well, there are a lot of different philosophical arguments for it, but one of the big ones is based on the idea of perfect knowledge. So if we say that God is omniscient, meaning God knows everything that has happened and will happen, then how could that knowledge ever change?
Because if God were to learn something new, that would mean that God didn't know something before, which goes against the whole idea of omniscience.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. The Stanford Encyclopedia brings up this idea of tenseless facts, meaning truths that are always true regardless of time.
Like 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, whether we're talking about yesterday, today, or even a million years from now.
Exactly. So the argument for immutability is that God must know all of these tenseless facts. And since these facts are timeless, God's knowledge of them can never change.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling argument. But that's not the only one, right? There are other famous philosophers that have weighed in on this whole debate.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're talking about some of the greatest minds in history, thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, each of them with their own nuanced take on divine immutability.
Let's break some of those down. I'm particularly interested in what Plato had to say.
So in Plato's Republic, he argues that since God is perfect, both in terms of goodness and beauty, God can't change for the better. Because if you're already perfect, how can you get more perfect? And any change for the worse would mean that God is becoming less perfect, which also isn't possible.
That makes sense. But what about changes that aren't necessarily about being better or worse? Like, let's say God starts composing a brand new symphony. Wouldn't that be a change?
That's a great question. And it really boils down to what we even mean by change when we're talking about God. Some scholars might say that even composing a symphony wouldn't be a real change for God because God's creative potential, that ability to compose, was already there internally.
So it's like God has all possible symphonies inside of God's being, even before they're composed in our sense of linear time.
Exactly. And that brings us to another fascinating argument from Aristotle. He talks about this idea of an unchanged changer. It's this first cause that sets everything else in motion but doesn't change itself. He talks about it in his physics.
So for Aristotle, the fact that change exists in the world means that there have to be an immutable being that transcends all of that change.
Right. And many theologians later on identified this unchanged changer that Aristotle talked about with God.
Okay, so we've got Plato talking about perfection and Aristotle talking about the very nature of change itself. What about Augustine? I know he had some thoughts about this as well, right?
Oh, yeah, he did. In his De Trinite, Augustine links immutability to God's essence. He points out that God's name is literally I am,
Right.
which suggests this idea of a being who is completely self-sufficient and unchanging.
This sense of just pure being, of existence without beginning or end.
Exactly. For Augustine, anything that changes can't be a truly perfect being because it's always in the state of becoming, always moving from one state to the next. It needs something outside itself for its existence and its identity. But God, as I am, simply is. There's no becoming, no change, just pure, eternal being.
This is all so fascinating. And then you've got Boethius, who brings in the concept of time itself, right?
He does. In the Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius argues that being in time means that you have certain imperfections. It means you have a past, a present, and a future.
And he saw that as some kind of limitation.
Exactly, because the past is gone, right? It's not accessible anymore, and the future isn't here yet. So both of them are kind of deprivation, but a truly perfect being would be free from those kinds of limitations.
So for Boethius, a perfect being must transcend time completely. And that means that God must also be immutable. This is all starting to come together.
But I can't help but think about some of the problems with this idea. Are there any strong arguments against immutability? Because it seems like this concept could run into problems when you think about God's relationship to the world, to human suffering, to free will.
Well, that's exactly where we're going next. Because even though there are strong arguments for it,
Yeah.
immutability has definitely faced some serious challenges over the centuries.
Yeah.
And those are exactly the challenges that we'll be exploring in part 2 of our deep dive.
I can't wait. This is where things are going to get really interesting, listener, so buckle up.
So, for all of the logical appeal of an immutable God, there's some pretty big challenges to think about. It's like you're building this huge philosophical structure, this amazing building, and then you start to think, oh, wait a minute, is the foundation even stable? Right, exactly. We even talk about how immutability makes sense if you're starting from a certain point. If you think about God as perfect and complete, but then you start reading those parts of Scripture,
Yeah.
where it seems like God changes his mind or maybe reacts emotionally. And you kind of have to stop and think, wait, how does all of this fit in?
Exactly. And that's where some of the most interesting philosophical debates come up. One of the biggest challenges is time. Because if God really is omniscient, knowing literally everything that will ever happen, doesn't that mean God's knowledge is always changing as time moves forward?
Because at one point, God knows that it's Monday and then the next moment it's Tuesday and so on and so on. It seems like change to me.
Right. And this is where philosophers like Avicenna and Norman Kretzmann, they really press this point. They argue that if God knows what time it is, then God's knowledge has to be constantly changing because, well, time itself is constantly changing.
Which would contradict the whole idea of immutability. So, how do people who support immutability, how do they respond to that? Do they just say, oh, well, God's knowledge is a mystery?
It's a little more nuanced than that. There are a few different ways they approach this. One is to really look at the nature of time itself. Some philosophers, like Paul Helm, he suggests that maybe there isn't just one universal now for all of reality.
So instead of thinking of time as one timeline, maybe there are different nows for different people or different parts of reality.
Exactly. And if that's true, if there are different nows, then maybe God's knowledge of time doesn't have to change in the way that Avicenna and Kretzmann said it does.
That's interesting. But I think there's another response that's even more mind-blowing. It has to do with how God knows things. Remember how the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions Aquinas? Where he says, building off of those ancient nominalists, that what God knows aren't propositions about events, but the events themselves.
Oh, yeah, Aquinas, always a fascinating thinker. So Aquinas is drawing on these nominalists that said that, for example, the sentences, Christ was born and Christ will be born, even though they seem to be about different times, they actually signify the same thing because they're referring to the same single event.
So it's like, for God, the event of Christ's birth is just one single timeless thing,
Yeah.
not something that's spread out through time in a way we experience it?
Exactly. And if the objects of God's knowledge are these timeless events, then God's knowledge doesn't have to change, even though our perception of time is always flowing.
This is really making my brain work.
Yeah.
But Aquinas goes even further, right? He's not just saying God's knowledge isn't just about affirming or denying sentences. He's saying it's a timeless intuition.
He is. He's saying God's knowledge isn't limited by language or propositions the way ours is. God has this direct grasp of reality that goes beyond our linear way of understanding time. So even though we see things as changing, God sees everything all at once, timelessly and unchangingly.
Okay, so that's a couple of responses to the time challenge. But what about those times where it seems like God changes his actions in Scripture? Like the flood story, for example.
Yeah.
God seems to regret creating humanity and decides to just start over. That doesn't sound very immutable.
I know what you mean. That's a great point. And it's something that theologians and philosophers have been trying to figure out for a long time. How do you reconcile God's actions changing with the idea of an unchanging God?
I mean, do they just say that those are metaphors? That they're not meant to be taken literally?
That's one approach. They might say that, for example, the flood story, it isn't meant to be taken literally, but as a kind of symbolic story about God's judgment and mercy.
Okay, so it's more about the theological message, not so much the historical details.
Right. They might say that God, because God knows the future, always knew that humanity would, well, mess up, and the flood was always part of the plan. So even though it seems like God's changing his mind, in reality, everything is happening according to God's eternal and unchanging will.
Okay, I could see how that interpretation could work. But what about the incarnation? That's a pretty big deal in Christianity. It seems like a pretty big change for God to suddenly become human. How do you make that work with immutability?
That's a tough one. But people who believe in immutability have come up with some explanations. The main idea is that any change that happened during the incarnation, it happened in the human nature that God the Son took on, not in God's divine nature.
So God's divine nature stayed the same, but God added a human nature, and that's where the change happened.
Exactly. They would say that God always intended to become incarnate, that this was always part of the plan. So it's not so much a change in God's being as it is like God revealing an aspect of himself that was always there but not yet visible in the world.
I'm starting to notice a pattern here. It seems like a lot of the ways people defend immutability depend on the idea that God exists outside of time, that God isn't stuck in this linear progression from the past to the present to the future.
You're absolutely right. This concept of divine timelessness is a big part of a lot of these arguments. If God sees all of time at once, then God's knowledge and actions don't have to change in the way we might think they would for someone who experiences time moment by moment.
This brings up another problem with immutability that I've been thinking about. It has to do with God's power. Before creation, God could have just, not created the universe. But now that creation has happened, it seems like God can't go back and undo it. So hasn't God lost some power?
Yes, the argument from God's power. It does seem like something's different about what God is able to do. But of course, the immutability folks, they have a response for this too.
Okay, what is it? How do they get around this one?
They would say that God still has all of the same power God has always had. But what's changed is the opportunity to use that power in certain ways. So God might still be able to undo creation, hypothetically, but it just doesn't really make sense anymore. Because, well, creation already happened.
It's like saying, I still have the ability to learn to play the piano, but I've kind of missed the opportunity to be a child prodigy. Because, well, I'm not a child anymore.
Perfect analogy. It really shows how this whole debate about immutability is often about how we define words like change, power, and even time.
It does. And honestly, listening to all of these arguments and all the counter-arguments, I'm starting to wonder if maybe immutability isn't the right way to think about God after all.
I think that's a valid question. It's a question that a lot of philosophers and theologians have struggled with. There are other ways of thinking about God's relationship to time, change, and the world, ways that don't rely on this strict idea of immutability.
This has been such a thought-provoking discussion. Listener, if you're as fascinated by this whole philosophical roller coaster as I am, you definitely won't want to miss the last part of our deep dive.
All right, listener, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into divine immutability. And honestly, my head is spinning. We've looked at the arguments for it, the challenges to it. I don't know, I'm a little lost. I get it, it's a lot to take in. But that's what makes this topic so interesting. It makes us think about some really fundamental questions about, like, what is God? What is time? Even what is free will?
Speaking of free will, there's this one argument against immutability that I can't stop thinking about. It's the one from Richard Swinburne. He basically says that if God can't change at all, then God can't really act freely.
Yeah, Swinburne's argument, it's a good one. And it gets right to the heart of how we define freedom. He's saying that if God is totally unchanging, then every choice God makes, every action, even every thought, would all be set in stone for all eternity. There wouldn't be any room for spontaneity, no way for God to choose something different.
So God wouldn't be free in any real sense, and that kind of goes against how we usually think of God, as this being who can act freely and respond to the world in a way that feels, I don't know, dynamic.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of divine timelessness gets even more important. If you want to believe in immutability and free will at the same time.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
Mhm.
But how does timelessness solve this problem?
Well, think about it. If God experiences all of time at the same time, then the whole idea of something being predetermined gets really weird. From God's point of view, there's no before or after, no linear chain of events that lead to a certain choice. God sees every possibility, every single choice, all at once.
So God's choices aren't predetermined in the way we think of it, but rather they're all just always there in God's awareness.
Right. It's like God is outside of time looking at the whole tapestry of history all at the same time. And in that tapestry, you see all these different threads representing all the choices that could be made.
So God chooses them all, but in a way that doesn't mess with our free will.
Right. It's a hard concept, but it's at the heart of how philosophers and theologians try to explain this. God knowing what we will choose doesn't force us to choose it.
Okay, I get that. But talking about timelessness always brings me back to this one big question.
Yeah.
If time really does pass for God, doesn't that mean that God has to change in some way? Even if it's just God changing in relation to time itself.
That's a sharp observation, and it really shows us the paradox here. Because if God is within time, experiencing it like we do, then God's moving from one moment to the next, from one state of awareness to another. And that seems like a pretty clear example of change, right? Even if it's just a change in how God experiences time.
Exactly. Like at one moment, God would be experiencing Monday with us, and then boom, it's Tuesday.
Yeah.
It just seems like that has to be a change.
It does. And this is where the idea of divine timelessness comes back in as a possible answer. If God is truly beyond time, then God wouldn't have to go through those changes in time. God would just experience all of time at once in this single eternal now.
I can see why the idea of timelessness is so important here, but it's such a hard concept to really grasp.
Mhm.
Logically, yeah, it makes sense. But what would it actually be like to experience reality that way?
I know it's one of those things that really pushes the limits of what we humans can understand. But luckily, there are some really smart people who have tried to help us understand it.
Who, for example?
Mm.
I need all the help I can get when it comes to this.
Well, one model that I find really helpful is the one from Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann. They talk about something called ET simultaneity to describe how God, who is eternal, relates to time.
ET simultaneity. Sounds complicated.
It is a little bit, but it's worth trying to get our heads around. The basic idea is that each moment in time, as it actually exists, is present to God's eternal awareness. But it's not like God's sitting on a timeline looking back at the past and forward to the future. It's more like all of time is present to God in this one, timeless now.
So instead of thinking of time as this straight line, maybe we should think of it as a circle, with God right in the middle, experiencing all the points on that circle all at once.
That's a great way to picture it. It helps us understand how God can be involved in every single moment in time without actually changing. God's relationship to Monday is just as real as God's relationship to Tuesday or Wednesday or any other day. It's all happening at the same time from God's eternal perspective.
This is blowing my mind. But it's also beautiful in a way. It's like this picture of God who is intimately involved in every part of our existence, not just watching us from afar, but truly present with every single one of us. Always.
That's a really lovely way to put it. It shows us that the idea of God not changing, instead of pushing God away from us might actually show us a deeper connection. If God really is unchanging, then God's love for us, God's care for us, God's presence in our lives, it's all constant. It's something we can always count on no matter what we go through.
This has been an incredible journey, listener. We've gone from the basic philosophical ideas of immutability all the way to how it applies to God. And we've asked some really, really big questions along the way.
And what's amazing is that even after all this time, after centuries of people debating this, there's still no easy answer to the question of whether God changes or not.
And that's okay. That's what's so cool about philosophy and theology, too, is that they push us to keep asking questions, to keep exploring, and to try to understand ourselves and the universe better.
As we've been talking, there's one question that keeps popping up in my mind, and it's a question I want to leave you with, listener. If God really does see all of time at once, like in that Stumpf-Kretzmann model we talked about, what does that mean for how we think about free will and how God interacts with the world? Does God knowing everything we'll ever choose somehow take away from our freedom? Or does it actually make us more free? Does it mean we're part of a bigger story, a story that goes beyond how we experience time? It's a question worth thinking about, and I have a feeling it's going to keep philosophers and theologians busy for a long time to come.
That's a great place to end things. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, listener. It's been an amazing conversation. We hope you've learned something new. And until next time, keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.